The invasion of Ukraine by Russia is some of the first large-scale war we've seen in Europe since World War II, and the first large-scale conflict since then involving a major power. I'm not going to talk much about the invasion itself, as things are happening quite fast, and by the time I upload this, anything I say will almost certainly be out of date. One thing I will talk about, however, is the namesake of this channel and how it has played a major role in the rhetorical aspect of this conflict: history. A couple days after the invasion, one of my professors changed the lesson for that day away from our scheduled topic of modern Germany. Instead, he talked to us about the situation in Ukraine, delving into the history of false flag attacks, the allusions by both sides to German history, and the use of history in speeches by Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. I'll leave the first two topics to him, but something I wanted to expand on in this video is the contentious point of Ukrainian identity and statehood. As we'll see in this video, Putin has insisted that Ukraine is not a real country and is in fact part of Russia. Putin, however, is a man of history, and he has read up on this topic and written about it. So how did he come to these conclusions, and more importantly, is he right? After all, Putin's entire justification for keeping Ukraine in the Russian orbit hinges on this historical narrative he has woven for himself and the Russian and Ukrainian people. Many in the West are of course already disinclined to believe anything he says, but even if most people already disagree, it is still a good practice to actually engage with the content of Putin's argument rather than Putin himself. In this way, we more thoroughly debunk false claims of the past and in the process educate ourselves and better prepare ourselves to engage in disagreement and argue our own side, especially when opinion is not so skewed as in this case. So today, we're going to be answering the question: is Putin right about Ukraine? To answer this question, we will need to look at a few things. First, we need to understand what Putin has said, his arguments through speeches and writing, and the significance of these arguments for the current situation. Then, I will look at the history of the Ukrainian people, exploring the emergence of the Slavs and their proliferation into the various groups we know today. Thirdly, I will explore the development of the post-Mongol Eastern Slavic groups in more depth, as this period is where we really see the connections and differences between modern Russians and Ukrainians. To round this out, I will explore the political history of Ukraine in the post-Mongol period and investigate the nature of Ukrainian statehood into the modern era, including other states that have existed in this area, and building off of the other notions we're looking at, determining the lands that could be considered historically Ukrainian. This section will also look at how these various groups are defined and, perhaps more importantly, how they define themselves. This video is going to be split into two parts. The first one, which you're watching right now, will look at Putin's statements regarding Ukrainian history and nationhood, as well as Ukrainian history from the roots of the Slavic people to the rise of nationalism in the 1800s. The second part of this video will look at Ukrainian history from World War I to the fall of the Soviet Union, as well as conclusions regarding Putin's read on Ukrainian history and nationhood, and the issues of identity that complicate this whole thing and what comes with being a Ukrainian or being a Russian. So first things first, what does Putin think about Russo-Ukrainian history? Putin has spoken and written on this subject multiple times, but the best single place we find his thoughts on this is a 2021 piece he wrote called "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." Throughout the piece, Putin takes us on a chronological journey of the Eastern Slavic world, a chronology we'll look at in depth later. Starting around the 8th century, he talks about the Rus, a medieval ethnos that controlled a loose affiliation of states spanning Eastern Europe from the North Sea to the Black, sharing in language, religion, and custom. The epicenter of the world of the Rus, however, was the city of Kyiv, where various rulers held court and exercised influence across the region. By the 13th century, the Mongols had arrived on their doorstep, and invasion decimated the region. Over time, however, Eastern Europe would recover, this time with a new center of power, Moscow, further to the north. The Muscovite realm grew, becoming what we now know as Russia, expanding across Eastern Europe and retaking lands that were historically Rus. Not all of these lands could be reclaimed, however, as a neighbor to the west, Lithuania, also quickly expanded, taking many Slavs for itself. In the late medieval period, Lithuania would unify with Poland, bringing Catholicism to the land and subjugating the truly Rus population. Even so, the Russians held in captivity by the Westerners were still seen as brothers with absolutely identical language and differences in vernacular insignificant. While expansion was stymied to the west, expansion south proved more successful, reunifying Moscow with its ancestral predecessor of Kyiv. The southern area of the territory went by multiple names, including Malorussia, Little Russia, or Ukraina, which translated to periphery. This later term would eventually transform into the word Ukraine. By the early modern period, this area was not only under Russian control, but also shared deep similarities with Moscow, including the Orthodox faith and common East Slavic ancestry. Ukraine still had some elements that distinguished it from Moscow, such as the famed Cossack warriors. However, even they were brotherly with the empire, playing a key role in expanding east in battling Russia's enemies. To the south, Ottomans threatened to kill the Slavs in their quest for expansion, while to the west, Poland and the influence of the rest of Europe threatened to subjugate and Polonize. The western lands of the ancient Rus would eventually be regained, finally liberating the Russians from Polish rule, and the golden age of Russian art flourished. Poets and writers from across the realm, with their shared language, explored the complexities of the human condition, as well as the nature of their shared Russian heritage. Greats from Russia proper, such as Dostoevsky, Pushkin, and Tolstoy, shared the Slavo space with their southern countrymen, including Kotlyarovsky, Skovoroda, and Shevchenko. The 19th century, however, was not only a time of Russo-Ukrainian unification. In the western reaches of the Russian Empire, Polish elites, outraged at the partitions and complete liquidation of their country, began to foment regional nationalist movements across Central and Southern Europe. Time after time, the Poles attempted to regain the state that the lay people had never believed in, using means of violent revolt throughout the century. It was here that the beginnings of the Ukrainian nationalism began, not from a genuine belief that Kyiv was separate from Russia, but from cynical manipulation on the part of long-time oppressive neighbors. Quote, "The idea of Ukrainian people as a nation separate from the Russians started to form and gain ground among the Polish elite and a part of the Malorussian intelligentsia. Since there was no historical basis, and could not have been any, conclusions were substantiated by all sorts of connections, which went as far to claim that the Ukrainians are the true Slavs and the Russians, the Muscovites, are not. Such hypotheses became increasingly used for political purposes as a tool of rivalry between European states. By the turn of the century, these sentiments gained more steam and were even leveraged by Russia's rival empire, Austria, who created quote-unquote Ukrainian units during the First World War and imported separatist ideals to weaken Russia. In 1917, with the collapse of the Russian Empire, Ukrainian nationalists seized an opportunity to gain independence. However, this was quickly quashed when the Central Powers used the newly formed nation as a vassal to aid their war effort. The turmoil that engulfed Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the war afflicted Ukraine as well, with the country being reinvented and invaded multiple times before finally integrating into the Soviet Union in 1922. Here, Putin says, is where the Ukrainian nation was truly born. The Bolsheviks, caring not for nationalist identity, humored the Ukrainians, outlining the borders of the republic and solidifying a sense of separateness from Russia and other East Slavic nations. This carving up of Eastern Europe between the constituent republics of Russia, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine was the true reason that these nations exist independent of each other today. Not historical or cultural differences, but the cynical lines on a map drawn by men who did not even believe in the idea of a country. Like the rest of the USSR, Ukraine suffered horrendous famine in the 1930s, and again was victimized by the German invasion during World War II, although not without its fair share of collaboration. The borders of Ukraine, Belarus, and Baltics shifted, and by the time the Soviet Union fell in 1991, they were unrecognizable from their forms not even a century earlier. Rather than truly and completely rebuke the USSR by reverting to pre-Union borders, the republics remained as they were the day before they exited the bloc. Even if the claim of there being no historical Ukraine were put aside and rejected, Ukraine still would not be entitled with its current borders. This separation was not totally catastrophic, however. After all, these nations, with the exception of the Slavo-Baltic states, maintained close ties with Russia during the 1990s and early 2000s. Families lived across borders, and Russian remained a dominant tongue. But 2013 marked a turning point, when once again the West intervened in the Slavic harmony. This time not only Poland, but also the EU, United States, and NATO infiltrated the halls of power in Ukraine. The Euromaidan coup removed President Yanukovych, the nation's defender of Russian solidarity, and replaced him with a regime in the pocket of the West. The patriotic people of Ukraine did not stand for this, however, and regions of Ukraine that had once been independent, namely Crimea and Donbass, declared independence and welcomed Russian liberators. Putin also criticizes the current pro-Western regime in Ukraine, accusing them of denying history to advance their own power. Quote, "In essence, Ukraine's ruling circles decided to justify their country's independence through the denial of its past. However, except for border issues. They began to mythologize and rewrite history, edit out everything that united us, and refer to the period when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire and Soviet Union as an occupation." The common tragedy of collectivization and famine of the early 1930s was portrayed as the genocide of the Ukrainian people. He even goes so far as to compare them to Russia's historical enemies, including the Poles, Austrians, and Nazis. Fast forward to the night of the invasion in 2022, and Putin gives a speech to the Russian people. Here, he begins his speech with many of the same claims, and he is remarkably consistent. Here, like in his writing, he puts most of his emphasis on the Soviet era and how it created Ukraine artificially in order to maintain political power. So, all of this leads to the question, what does this mean for the modern day? We know how Putin sees the world, but we need to figure out what he wants. We can start with Russian prestige. It is generally accepted that Putin, along with many Russians, would like to see Russia returned to its status of glorious superpower, similar to their role during the Cold War minus the communism. Part of this is of course economic, which seems to be a losing battle. Besides oil, Russia has little advantage in the modern world. China is expanding influence in Asia, and its population, any nation's biggest resource, is going downhill as well. Birth rates are declining, and as a result, the average of the population is getting older, creating a greater strain on the economy via medical and retirement pensions, without the benefit of taxable income or contribution to the workforce. Further, the Russian population has become quite cynical, a trend that has existed since the 1980s. Communism failed them, as did liberal democracy under Yeltsin. The grand ideas that were supposed to bring Russia to greatness have failed. But another way to restore Russia to its former glory is by expanding its territory. Putin effectively claims that various regions of Eastern Europe are truly Russia. At the very least, he believes these countries and regions should have close ties to Russia and favor them over the West. Certain places, namely Belarus, already fall into this category, being a pro-Russian state with a very large Russian-speaking population. Others, such as Ukraine, are becoming more pro-Western, although certain parts of those countries actually tend to be pro-Russian, such as Crimea. This is where invasion comes into the equation, as Putin wants to quote-unquote liberate these pro-Russian areas from an opposing nation. Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia were another example of this in 2008, and Transnistria and Moldova is another possible future target. These takeovers of pro-Russian exclaves are, however, just the very lowest of what Putin could want. As of this video, it's not even known for sure what Putin wants from his invasion of Ukraine, whether it's just a regime change and annexation of Donbass, or a larger territorial expansion. Turning back to his opinion on Russo-Ukrainian and wider Russo-Slavic relations, we see that Putin believes that Russia should control far more than just Donbass. Belarus is also on that list, as well as wider Ukraine, either the eastern half or the entire country. In fact, Putin not only seems to claim the areas controlled by the Soviet Union or Russian Empire, but goes even farther back to the Rus. If we superimpose a map of historic Rus lands on modern Europe, we see that he's effectively calling for control of Belarus and Ukraine, as well as northern Romania and Moldova. If we overlay a map of the Russian Empire at its greatest extent in 1914, we see even more territory going as far as Poland, the Baltics, Finland, and the South Caucasus. Putin seems to lay claim to pretty much everything Russia has ever touched, as he uses ancient Rus history to justify Russo-Ukrainian unity and also says things about Russia reclaiming land in Poland in the 18th and 20th centuries. That being said, we need to ask two more questions which Putin does not answer. How does he want to control these areas? And does he place emphasis on the historically Rus people or Rus lands? Looking at the first question, we don't have a clear map. Obviously, Putin, with invading neighboring countries and annexing opportune areas that already have some level of pro-Russian sentiment, as seen in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Crimea, and Donbass. He also seems to be content, at least for the moment, with controlling historically Russian areas with close economic and political ties without any invasions, as seen in Ukraine pre-2013 and modern Belarus. This is more in the vein of satellite states than actually making these nations part of Russia. And as we're seeing now, Putin is also okay with invading an entire country and justifying it with historical claims. Putin certainly seems to be getting more aggressive, although I won't be looking at his military and political endeavors in depth here. That being said, he certainly seems to be assembling a wider Russian bloc, and he certainly seems increasingly comfortable with using force if willing satellite states run short. The other question looks at what criteria Putin uses to determine what territory he considers Russian. Just using these map overlays, we're looking at areas historically controlled by Russia. That being said, Putin for the most part doesn't use historical maps and borders to justify his claims, but rather the people who live in those territories. This raises the question of whether Putin is interested in the historic Russian land or the historic Russian people. Much of this highlighted territory historically was home to Russian speakers, however things have changed a lot over the centuries. Most notably after World War II, we see mass-scale migration and reorganization of countries along ethno-national borders. A good microcosm of this to look at might be Poland. If we look at linguistic maps of Poland through the centuries, we see that it tends to be quite diverse. In these maps from 1834 and 1863, we see that the former territory of Poland was home to Polish, German, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian speakers. Even in 1918, we see that these ethnic groups largely remained intact. After 1945, however, we see that Poland changed. Obviously, the borders were redrawn, with these eastern regions with the large Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Baltic populations going to the USSR, republics of Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, respectively. In the West, Poland expanded, and the German populations were genocided and forced out. Today, Poland is 98% Polish-speaking and 97% ethnic Pole. By the same token, most of Europe was reorganized after World War II, and countries that used to have large populations that spoke another language have now been reorganized, and those language speakers have been moved around. We certainly see that there are some sizable Russian pockets outside of Russia, namely in Belarus and the Ukrainian borderlands and the Latvian frontier, but most of this territory formerly controlled by Russia is no longer Russian-speaking. Looking at a map of the percentage of Russians in a given country, we see that this mirrors the borders from the USSR, although it also brings up a question of how to define a Russian, which we'll get into later. Regardless, this causes a conflict. It's possible that Putin only seeks to control ethnically or linguistically Russian areas, and that's a very big distinction. However, this would dramatically reduce the amount of territory he could lay claim to, and given the small size of the Russian diaspora, likely wouldn't go very far towards making Russia a world power. Given his invasion of Georgia as well as Ukraine as a whole, we already know that he is willing to invade areas that don't speak Russian, and it seems like he may be more interested in the historical territory rather than modern-day ethnographics. This leads us to the next section. Putin tells his version of Eastern Slavic history, but what does he get right, what does he get wrong, and, perhaps most importantly, what does he exclude? To quote Putin himself, "To have a better understanding of the present and look into the future, we need to turn to history." The Slavic peoples first emerged in Eastern Europe around the 6th century AD, migrating from the east in the aftermath of the Hunnic conquests, occupying the lands abandoned by the German peoples who were pushed out. There is a legend in Slavic mythology that tells of Pan and his 3 sons, who founded the principal branches of Slavic peoples. The 3 brothers went hunting, each going in a different direction and settling there. Shek went west, Lesh went north, and Rus went east. Together with their father, they formed the 4 main branches of the Slavic peoples. Pan in the south is representative of the Balkan Slavs, who today make up the peoples of Serbia and the former Yugoslavia, as well as Bulgaria. Czech, unsurprisingly, represents the Western Slavs and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And in the north, Lesh represents Poland, and to the east, Rus represents the Rus peoples of modern Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. In the southern regions of the East Slavic lands, a flag of blue and yellow, symbolizing water and fire, would be used in battle as well as religious rituals. The eastern regions would also be inhabited by Scandinavian travelers, moving down the rivers around this time, although these people would become integrated into an existing Slavic society. Historically, these groups and their sub-nationalities have all developed different cultures, although some characteristics define the various groups. Southern and Eastern Slavs of the Balkans and Kievan Rus are more similar to each other than the Western Slavs, which generally includes Poland and Czechoslovakia, as well as Croatia. While the West kept more similarities to Western Europe and adopted Catholicism and the Latin alphabet, the East developed independently and more closely to Byzantium, adopting Orthodox Christianity and the Cyrillic alphabet. While all of these Slavic groups have close ties and many cultural similarities, we will be focusing on the Eastern Slavs, as most of Putin's historical argument centers around this group rather than Slavdom as a whole. The Kievan Rus are thought to have been started by Prince Oleg, the ruler of Novgorod. Oleg ruled over the Rus and was part of the Rurik dynasty, which was started in 862 AD by his father. Expanding south along the Dnieper River, Oleg absorbed other Slavic fiefdoms into his realm, culminating in the capture of Kyiv in 882, solidifying his power against rival Khazars who controlled trade near the Black Sea. Vladimir the Great, the Kievan Rus' most revered leader, would consolidate the Rurik realm and convert the land to Orthodox Christianity in 988, becoming a saint in the process. Vladimir would also play a major role in writing the first Russian history textbook, cementing a theme that unified Kyiv and Novgorod. The Kievan Rus would reach their territorial peak in the 11th century, intermingling with Vikings and warring with Baltic, Polish, and Turkic foes. Eventually, however, the Kievan Rus began to decline, with invasions from the east weakening trade to the Baltic Sea, and factionalism among the Rus cities weakening the empire. By the end of the century, the empire had fragmented into various states, with little in the way of unifying power. The 2 most powerful of these states, however, was Kyiv in the south and the Novgorod Republic in the north. 1132 was the end of a truly unified Kievan Rus state, and by 1169 Kyiv was sacked by northern princes, solidifying the disintegration of the empire. Despite the political fragmentation, the Rus still dominated Eastern Europe, with Kyiv as their spiritual and cultural center. This would come to a final end, however, in the early 13th century. In 1237, Batu Khan and the Mongols ravaged the Kievan Rus lands, sacking and destroying virtually every city in the region except for Novgorod and the Pskov region. The northern realm was largely spared as a result of the capitulation of Alexander Nevsky, the Prince of Novgorod at the time. As a result of his cooperation with the Mongols, Nevsky not only kept his position as head of Novgorod, but also gained the princeship in Vladimir and Kyiv. Nevsky's son, Danily Alexandrovich, would found the Duchy of Moscow under Mongol vassalage. For centuries, the Kievan Rus were fragmented. While the Mongols were relatively decentralized rulers, only collecting taxes and confirming appointments, the initial conquest had decimated the region's population and fundamentally scrambled its political structure. To the south, Mongols integrated large parts of what is now Ukraine into the Golden Horde, while in the north, various Rus principalities served as vassal states. In the west throughout the 14th century, Lithuania expanded from the South Baltic region, taking much of Ruthenia and areas that are today Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. In 1385, Lithuania was converted to Catholicism, introducing an element of religious tension to the land. While the noble classes of the duchy became Catholic, most people within Lithuania were still pagan, and the regions of Lithuania's expanded territory were mostly Orthodox. That being said, little in the way of conversion or discrimination took place, as Poland-Lithuania was famously tolerant, allowing Orthodox Christians, Jews, pagans, and even Muslims equality within the Catholic population. Back in the east, the Vladimir-Moscow region was gaining in power. The Golden Horde had assigned this area to collect taxation from the Russian vassals, giving Moscow political clout. Additionally, at the turn of the 14th century, the head of the Russian Church moved from Kyiv to Moscow, effectively replacing the southern city as the political and spiritual heart of the Kievan Rus. This, in conjunction with a general decline of the Mongols, led to open opposition and a Russian military victory at the Battle of Kolikovo in 1380. Now, the powers of Lithuania and Moscow were expanding across East Slavic lands, competing for the remnants of the Horde's westernmost holdings. In the late 1400s, Ivan III made massive strides in expanding Moscow's influence. Ivan took Novgorod and its territory, and with the fall of Constantinople, declared Moscow as the Third Rome, becoming the home of Orthodox Christianity. In a break with the region's past, Ivan also centralized the Russian government around himself, in accordance with a similar trend across most of Europe. His son, Ivan the Terrible, further consolidated his power, becoming the first Tsar of Russia and expanding the territory even more in the east. Kyiv, however, wouldn't be reincorporated into Russia for some time. In fact, you may have noticed that Kyiv and the southern Rus lands haven't really been mentioned since the Mongol takeover 300 years before the reign of Ivan the Terrible. In the south, things went quite differently. Unlike Novgorod, Kyiv was decimated as a result of Mongol invasion. What was once the center of Kievan Rus civilization was destroyed, its inhabitants scattered, and cultural and political clout moving north. The city of Kyiv, like the north, was a vassal of the Golden Horde. However, the sheer destruction it had endured made it a minor player in the region. As time went on, the Golden Horde was slowly replaced as the dominant power in the region. In the Middle Ages, the kingdom of Galicia Volhynia came to rise in the region that is today southern Belarus and western Ukraine. However, this fell to its neighbor in the west after about 200 years. Starting in the 13th century, Lithuania expanded southeast, even sharing Kyiv with the Horde for about 40 years until 1362, when the Europeans finally took it for themselves. For about 200 years, the Lithuanian nobility and Ukrainian population would live in relative harmony, with religious pluralism and a relatively hands-off approach to the rulership. This would eventually change, and that's something that we'll look at in a minute. In the south, northern coasts of the Black and Azov Seas would fall under control of the Crimean Khanate, a polity ruled by Tatars who had become sedentary in the region and had taken over from the fading Golden Horde, which would fully dissipate at the beginning of the 1500s. But despite these polities laying claim to the region, Ukraine was still largely autonomous and chaotic. This nebulous nature took many forms, including settlement patterns, language, identity, and even how the region was referred to internally and externally. Let's look at the names for a minute. In the aforementioned article, Putin makes various claims about different names for Ukraine historically, and for the most part, all of them were used in various contexts. Going back in time, we see that the label of Ruthenia was applied to the lands of Kievan Rus, and was an exonym for the region in the rest of Europe. Within Kievan Rus, the term Ukraina, the word that is now Ukraine, was used within the region to denote its southern extremities, including Kyiv. Little Russia, or Malorussia, was a term originally created by the Orthodox Church in Constantinople to denote the different divisions of the church, which would split during the 1300s. Eventually, this title would become synonymous with geography, and even later would be adopted into the Russian language. Going forward in this video, I will generally be using the term Ukraine to refer to this region. One of the most interesting things to happen during this period was a shift in language. To be sure, people in Ukraine mostly spoke Old Russian, although integration with Lithuania and later Poland would shift this. The Scythian language, brought by Turkic peoples that had historically inhabited similar regions in the Black Sea area, had also mingled with the language for centuries. Change accelerated in the 16th century, with Polish, German, and even Yiddish migrants moving into the area and further changing the language. By the end of the 1500s, Ukrainian had become a distinct language from Russian. But despite the creative results on the language front, Kyiv as a region would remain a city of contention and destruction, as raids from Crimean Tatars would decimate the city through the Middle Ages. This instability was especially prominent in the surrounding areas of Kyiv as well as parts of southern Muscovy. The steppe, a massive plain across southeastern Europe and West Asia, was effectively a Wild West, or perhaps more appropriately, a Wild East. The area was indefensible and inhabited by nomadic horsemen, making the region prime for slave raids from the Crimean Khanate and Ottoman Empire in the south. As a result, this area was largely depopulated, save for Turkic tribes in the Khanate. While parts of the steppe were technically the domain of European states, there was no effective governance or security, leading to the rise of another culture, the Cossacks. The origins of the Cossacks are not fully known, but they begin to appear and become key figures in this part of the world around the 16th century, mostly settling along major rivers and bodies of water, especially the Dnieper in Ukraine, Black Sea coasts, and the Don on the edges of Muscovy. The Cossacks were originally seasonal inhabitants, but began to settle along fortified areas of the rivers. Changing from opportunistic hunters and raiders to sedentary farmers with entire towns and communities, culturally they were mostly Orthodox Christians, but also drew from Turkic influences in terms of weapons and fashion. The Cossacks were known for their warfighting skills, starting first with Viking-esque raids along rivers and coastlines, before mastering horseback fighting and reigning over the wide open steppe. Using their warrior skills, they raided extensively against the Crimean Khanate and Ottoman Empire, as well as their European neighbors to the north and west. Their prowess in combat did not go unnoticed by Lithuanians, Poles, or Muscovites, however, and the Cossacks would often be leveraged by them to weaken their Islamic enemies and defend their southern borders. Their frequent incursions were also a thorn in the side of European powers, however, especially Poland, as Cossack raids were seen by the Ottomans as Polish military action, inciting frequent conflict between the two nations and justifying later regulation of Cossack activity by the Poles. Perhaps the most important defining characteristic for our purposes is the unique Cossack feature of democracy. As a whole, they were rather decentralized, with various clans or hosts being located across the steppe region under the auspices of various larger states. Within these hosts, however, democracy reigned. All members were allowed to speak, and a leader, referred to in Ukrainian as a hetman, would be elected to guide the host, although this position was far from secure and had to be maintained by good leadership. Women also had a larger role in Cossack society than neighboring states. The Zaporozhian Cossacks were perhaps the most well-known of the Cossack groups, making their capital on the Dnieper River in the Ukraine area. Their name, meaning beyond the rapids, referred to a fortified center, or sitch, famously built on an island near the southern end of the river. The Zaporozhians were also the primary Cossack host present in Ukraine, making them the center of our story. The Cossacks began to come into greater conflict with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Moscow during the 16th century. Serfdom arose at this time, threatening to bind people to their land, and as a result, many peasants from these areas fled to join the Cossacks, who enjoyed freedom largely unparalleled in Europe. This migration south would occur in Moscow as well a few decades later for the same reasons. However, The once untamed land of Ukraine became more and more integrated into the Commonwealth, bringing the Cossacks into the Polish fold. The nobles of the region were often forced to convert to Catholicism in accordance with a wider trend in Europe during the Counter-Reformation, and Polish was made the official language in the wake of the merger between the crowns of Poland and Lithuania. A Cossack registry was instated, which allowed for a certain number of Cossacks to live as they had before, although this was purely for the benefit of the Poles, who wished to use them as soldiers. This registry expanded and contracted with the need for warriors, and this lack of freedom led to many revolts throughout the late 16th and 17th centuries. Despite the repression, many Cossacks still gladly worked with Poland, fighting alongside them against the Ottomans and Moscow, even taking the latter in 1610, one of the few historical successes in this regard. Still, tensions ran high and came to a fever pitch in 1648 with the Khmelnytsky uprising. After a Polish noble abused the Cossack Bohdan Khmelnytsky and his family, he became hetman of the Zaporozhians and led a rebellion against the Poles. This led to the creation of an independent Cossack hetmanate, also known as the Zaporozhian Sich, and consisted of territory that includes much of modern Ukraine. Sadly, this would begin a period in Cossack history known as the Ruin. The hetmanate knew it could not survive on its own, and after failed relations with the Crimean Khanate, Khmelnytsky allied with Moscow with the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654. The treaty guaranteed autonomy to the Cossacks and made sure Cossack soldiers would only have to fight in their lands, and that Russia would have to come to their aid in the event of invasion. By this time, translators were needed between Khmelnytsky and the Russians, as the Ukrainian language had diverged so much as to be a separate language. These political proceedings proved to be a misstep for everyone involved, as Moscow and Poland went to war over this, and over time the Tsardom would slowly erode Cossack autonomy. This culminated in the Treaty of Andrusovo in 1667 and was confirmed with the Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1686, where Poland and Russia agreed to split the hetmanate in two. The west or right bank went to Poland, while the left bank, along with Kyiv, went to Moscow. The Cossacks were not involved in this process at all. Poland's right bank would continue to be troublesome, with the Cossacks allying with the Ottomans and even becoming part of Ottoman territory until their defeat at Vienna in 1683, at which point the Commonwealth repressed the hetmanate and dissolved it, even excising Cossacks from the military in 1699. On the left bank, the Cossacks remained somewhat autonomous, although far less than they were before. The Cossacks revived in the beginning of the 18th century with the rise of Ivan Mazepa, who became hetman of left bank Ukraine. During his time, the Cossacks saw a rise in cultural creation, with unique architecture and literature solidly defining Cossack separateness, as well as a revitalization of the city of Kyiv. After yet another revolt against Poland on the right bank, Mazepa intervened and took most of the Sich, including the Dnieper Cossacks, under Russia. With the start of the Great Northern War, the Cossacks suffered dearly, with their soldiers being forced to fight in far-off lands with poor equipment, causing them mass casualties, loss of morale, and leaving Ukraine open to attack from Poland, who had allied with the Swedes. When the Poles threatened to attack in 1708, Peter the Great of Russia refused to support Mazepa in its defense, causing him to change sides and join the Poles and Swedes against the Tsar. This was not popular among the Cossacks generally, with the exception of the original Zaporozhian Sich on the Dnieper, and only about 3,000 troops joined him. In retaliation, Peter sacked the left bank capital of Baturian and killed all disloyal Cossacks, further weakening the Cossack status in Russia. Elsewhere on the steppe, especially along the Don River, Cossacks became a part of developing Russian Empire, although like their Ukrainian cousins, they continued to be a thorn in the side of the Tsardom. Razum's rebellion in the 1670s, as well as Pugachev's rebellion 100 years later that took a sizable part of the empire, convinced the Russians to end the Cossack identity. Various renaming campaigns of the Cossack lands took place. Hereditary titles replaced the election process that had defined the Cossacks for centuries. and the destruction of the historic Zaporozhian Sich took place in 1775 under Catherine the Great. Over the coming decades, all traces of Cossack autonomy would be done away with, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would be wiped off the map, ensuring that all Cossack lands were controlled by the Russians. In response, many Cossacks migrated south to the Ottoman Empire, demonstrating how freedom and autonomy was far more important to the Cossacks than any commonalities with Russia. In response, Russia granted some special privileges to the Cossacks, hoping to keep them in the empire. The Cossacks continued to be an integral part of the Russian military, famously being used against Napoleon in his Russian campaign. Their combative prowess remained unmatched, leading the Frenchmen to famously utter, "Cossacks are the best light troops among all that exist. If I had them in my army, I would go through all the world with them." But while politically Ukraine was brought under the Russian gun, socially the region remained more freedom-minded than the rest of the empire. The institution of serfdom had swept through Russia, although the less populated areas with less nobles had less in the way of that. Further, the region still had a borderland that was vulnerable to attack from Ottomans. As a result, serfdom only fully came to the region in the mid-1800s, only a couple decades before the institution was abolished totally. Nonetheless, the crushing of the Cossack culture concluded a 500-year political separation between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian identity would continue into the 19th century, albeit in a less violent fashion. Like other ethnic minorities in the Russian Empire, Ukrainians took to literature and art to express their desire for an independent state. This was a reversal from trends in the 17th century, when Ukrainians often tried to emphasize the idea of two Russias in similarities with their northern cousins. But when inequality still plagued their relationship, and Russia insisted on subjugating Ukraine rather than restoring it to its previous position of power, Ukrainians emphasized themes of distinct culture in an attempt to grant legitimacy to their people and position in the world. While the Russian Empire was relatively open to its diverse cultural population, it began to restrict the Ukrainian language in 1863 in the aftermath of a Polish uprising. Uprisings seemed to be a common thread among the areas conquered by Russia. History was repeating itself just as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had gone from tolerant to oppressive a couple centuries before. This era was when Ukraine's most famous poet, Taras Shevchenko, wrote. Shevchenko, despite Putin's claims of him being a true Russian, is often considered the father of the modern Ukrainian language. One of his most famous poems, titled Testament, explicitly mentions Ukraine by name and demonstrates a love for the land and a distaste for oppressors. "When I die, let me rest. Let me lie amidst Ukraine's broad steppes. Let me see the endless fields and steep slopes I hold so dear. Let me hear the Dnipro's great roar. And when the blood of Ukraine's foes flows into the blue waters of the sea, that's when I'll forget the fields and hills and leave it all and pray to God. Until then, I know no God. So bury me, rise up and break your chains. Water your freedom with the blood of oppressors. And then remember me with gentle whispers and kind words in the great family of the newly free." Shevchenko ridiculed Russia and was even exiled in 1848 for being a part of a Ukrainian nationalist group and writing a poem that insulted the Tsar's wife. The poet also commented on Ukrainian nationalist figures of the past and ridiculed the Cossack Khmelnytsky for allying with Russia, who he saw as a worse tyrant than the Poles. During this period of Ukrainian reintegration into Russia, we see that Ukrainian nationalism was alive and well, and a sense of separateness from Moscow had certainly developed by this time organically. After all, nationalism, or any identitarian movement, tends to become stronger when the group in question is oppressed. Ukrainian nationalism did not only exist in Ukraine, but wherever Ukrainians settled in large numbers as well. Perhaps the most interesting example is Zheleny Klin, or Green Ukraine, an area of southeastern Siberia that became home to thousands of Ukrainians. Some of these people emigrated willingly, but many were also moved east to populate Russia's Siberian territories. Nevertheless, a Ukrainian nationalistic movement would spring up here as well, with the region even attempting to become independent in the 20th century. To the west, Ukrainians also celebrated their culture, and under the control of Austria, these Western Ukrainians in Lviv and Galicia often had more freedom of expression and nationalistic sentiment than their eastern neighbors. The aforementioned flag of blue and yellow, for example, began to be used in an official capacity, again starting in 1848 in these areas of Ukraine. While the empire was undergoing turmoil with the rise of Hungarian and other nationalistic fervors, the magistrate building of Lviv flew the bicolor in solidarity with Ukrainian nationalism. From then on, Ukrainian military divisions in Austria would adopt the flag as their banner. So that's it for part 1, everyone. Look out for part 2, that should be coming out soon if it's not already out. Again, that part will cover World War I through the fall of the Soviet Union, and I'll be drawing the conclusions on if Putin is correct about Ukrainian history and what it means to be a Ukrainian or a Russian, and how those concepts of identity make everything super complicated. As always, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. This one might not show up in the algorithm too much. As always, hope everyone has a great day, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.